Coogs House. A lot of interesting comments coming out of the post-game presser on Saturday. What does one of them in particular mean for a certain starter?
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougs, daily podcast all about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth. And whether you're a Houston fan or just a hater who came to stop by, thank you for making Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day. Appreciate you making us your first listen each and every day. If you want to join the conversation but don't know what to say, tell us in the comments down below if you ever got fired from your job. Because I think that's the conversation everyone's having these days. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Last tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. More on that later. But we do have a lot to talk about in this episode. I want to talk about a group that it looks like actually might have played all right in the game on Saturday. Are we allowed to say that about that game? I think so. I think they played all right. We'll talk more about that specifically. I want to talk about the defense and kind of some general concerns it looks like people are having. And we got to start with the commentary coming out of the post-game press conference that people are running with about the quarterback position. Now, during the game, starter Donovan Smith was benched for Zeon Chriss. Zeon transferred in from Louisiana. I keep wanting to say Lafayette, but Louisiana last year. Donovan transferred in January the year before from Texas Tech. And there's been a lot of discussion about who should and should not be playing. And, I think there's a lot of thought about well, does that mean that his conversation, I think afterwards, Fritz said something to the effect of every position, including the quarterback, would be evaluated and they'd be making decisions going forward from there. But in this football game, I don't know what to take from the benching besides just Donovan played really poorly. And I want to stress at the front end of this conversation that Donovan has played really poorly this year. He played okay a year ago. I would not put a lot of the offense failures on just him. I think that quarterbacks shoulder that all the time. I think there were a lot of people like myself that expected general progression from year 1 to 2 as a full-time starter, even with an offensive change. I thought that, or schematic change, I should say, I thought there were people like myself very even understanding that even with missing some springtime, like first game or two might be rough, but by the time we get a third of the way into the season, we'd be a lot better off. And now we're about a third of the way into the season, and we are not. And that changes how these things go. For instance, last year, he was completing about 67% of his passes, which is, I guess, not elite for college football, but it's certainly not bad. This year, we're closer to 50. Last year, average distance of target for Donovan Smith was past the first down marker. This year, it's considerably shorter. And I understand that, and I stressed that last year, it's the coach and it's the quarterback. And this year, we've changed the coach, so now it's just going to be the quarterback. And that's generally speaking how the simplest analysis on what goes wrong in football goes. But he has played poorly. And I think that's kind of the interesting line to walk here is well, he has played poorly, but it's not just him. If it were just a quarterback playing poorly, things would have looked a lot different thus far, right? I want to pause and say one criticism I don't like about people with Donovan Smith that they say both that he doesn't make enough reads and that he hits the check down too much. And as a football coach, I coached 9 years of high school football, so I hadn't done it a couple years, I guess. But in the long career I had with that sport, I have to say those two things cannot physically be happening with one another. You cannot be both not reading things and checking the ball down because that's the last read. So you can be critical of him on either side of that coin, I guess. But saying he's not doing the both of them legitimately doesn't make sense. Okay, that's my 2 cents there. No, I think that the interesting thing in looking at him has been he's playing tentatively and poorly, and he is hitting guys that are very, very short as far as distance goes. That makes you wonder about the injury he had last year and what the real healing of that may be. But I'm here to tell you, I still think he's going to end up being the starter. Before you shout at me and yell at me, his backup, Zeon Chriss, has completed just 2 passes, I believe, this year. He completed 2 passes in the game against Cincinnati, was 2 of 5. I don't believe they even let him attempt a pass prior to that this season. They certainly didn't against UNLV. He didn't play against Oklahoma. I don't think he threw a pass against Rice there when he came at the end. I mean, this is the only 2 completions he's had. They clearly don't trust him to push the ball down the field. He comes in, it's quarterback sweep, quarterback read option, quarterback power, right? A lot of running the quarterback kinds of things. And he's a strong runner. And I'd be the first to tell you, I think he's a better runner than Donovan. And the unfortunate thing is, Donovan was a really good runner at Tech, and he's not shown that at Houston, right? He just won't. And that's unfortunate as well. But Zeon Chriss is never supposed to be the starter this year. It wasn't supposed to be a job he came and stepped into. He was a packety gadget guy this year, learns the job. He and Carlisle kind of push each other next year, that made the best man win. And then you add in Keyshawn Henderson the year after that. That's kind of the projected way this position was supposed to go before you factor in any other transfers or anything like that, right? And presently, it looks like people are already trying to fast forward some of that timeline. And Zeon's not going to – you can't start a quarterback you don't trust to pass the ball. I'm not saying he has to pass the ball a whole lot of the game, but you have to have demonstrated trust that you will have him do it. And Zeon hasn't been that guy. And then everyone goes to Uyale. And I think it's the interesting one because he is the third string guy. He worked his way into the backup, overtaking the job from Lucas Coley a year ago. Got bumped to third string this year. And honestly, the inside stuff I got, I guess, is that if McMickle had not torn his ACL over the summer, you might have had OLA as the fourth string, actually, right? And I think people are really hyped on a couple of plays he made, one against Sam Houston a year ago, and then his drive at the end of UNLV and garbage time this year. And I think they both showed, I mentioned after the UNLV game, like enough to be like, hey, maybe we tried him out there in like the second quarter of a game or something to see kind of what it looks like. But I don't think there's enough there to make the start. He completed 4 passes last year as the second string quarterback. He completed just 4 passes in the air. The ball traveled an average of about 7 yards. Everyone thinks about the Stacey Snead run and how the run after that catch was so electric against Sam Houston, but the ball was not in the air very far, right? And the guy took off with it. This year, he's 7 of 8. Admittedly, it was all on that drive at the end of the UNLV game. Kind of prevented the shutout in that game. Our backups, their backups, mostly. There were a couple of stars on the field for Houston still, including Joseph Manjack, who got his touchdown. And frankly, I'm glad Joseph Manjack got his touchdown. As a coach, I appreciate that move from Fritz to be like, hey, this guy deserves it. But also, in that drive, the ball stayed really less than 15 yards from ever going downfield. There was no big cannon downfield of any. 2 of his throws, in fact, 2 of Ale's throws were behind line of scrimmage, right? The same kind of offense. So schematically, you're not going to change it. The problems will still be there, right? I have no indication that unless they get him more reps in earlier parts of games, there's any reason to think that he would be the starter. I know people come in, but, and like just I don't think you're looking at 2 or 3 throws. And that's not the full body of work. I mean, it came at the end of the Central Florida game last year, I think it was, and the game was too fast. It was just too fast for him, and that's not a bad character trait or some flaw. It means you can't start. And yes, against the backups UNLV, it was fine. Yes, against the backups of first year in FBS, Sam Houston, you can hit a slant in stride. And yes, I'm sure he's all indications a good kid, a good person. I don't mean to say that, but it doesn't mean starter. And I think the thing that Houston fans are having trouble grappling with from a program that's had electric quarterbacks. You can go back to Cleaner Aware, but you can go more recently since Keenum, Ward. I think people are underrating how great Clayton Tune was. Uh, we don't talk about how Derek King finished, but all of the like Houston's had great quarterbacks, right? And so it's hard for people to stomach this idea, like, well, maybe the best we got on the roster is Donovan. And I think that if he's the guy that played like the way he finished against West Virginia last year, frankly, the high completion percentage this year against Oklahoma, there are moments where, like, okay, we can work with that. We can build around that. The real issue with this year has not been the guy, but the consistency of the guy. The guy has not progressed from a year. I think the way he's played, he's regressed. And that's the more troubling thing. It's not that they need to find someone else on the roster. Like, McMichael, he tore his knee or whatever, right? But outside of that, I think you've kind of, what you got in those options. I think the unfortunate thing is that everyone had this option. Coaching staff is excited to come coach him as the option. And he looks like he's gotten worse. And that's not good. He was projected by CBS Sports to be a draft pick in the spring because people assumed he would get better. And that's just not what's happened. And so that's where we are. And I think the commentary after the game, it's easy to be like, blame the quarterback. Gotta go because you didn't put up any points. I think it's lazy. There, I said it. And I think there's more to it than just that. And I do think that there's also room to be critical of a guy that's not playing very well. And I think that's what it sounds like Fritz is doing as well by saying that they're going to evaluate. And we'll see. I'd be surprised if they started a guy that they're not comfortable with having him throw a pass. But we'll see. I'll talk more about the defense because, that's the other half of the ball. And that is a part that also did not play very well on Saturday in a second. But first, today's show is brought to you by FanDuel, and NFL fans can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll start with over $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. You put your first $5 bet down at FanDuel.com. That's FanDuel.com. All right, back here at Locked on Coogs Park Rangers, and I'm talking about the defense a little bit today as well. The defense, I think, is a unit on this team that Houston is going to have to rely on a lot, and I understand why that is. However, the defense didn't look great on Saturday. It gave up 24 first-half points, and I think the concern is in the present tense. Oh, no. Football is a copycat sport. What did Houston just put out there that the whole world's going to see? And are they in trouble? Will other teams be able to replicate what Cincinnati did? Is Iowa State sitting there taking notes and licking their chops like, oh my goodness, this is going to be a bloodbath? And I don't think that has to be the case. First, in the reaction episode, I said, but I'll say it again. I think part of this is what you get when you lean so heavily into one side of the ball. And I said that then, I say it again. Houston depends mightily on the idea that their defense will carry them. They'll play defense and run the ball. That's what Willie did at Tulane. And that's what Barbay's offense did at Mississippi State and App State, right? I mean, that's what they were going to do always. But when you only have half of that equation, you're frankly limiting the amount of variables you can have go poorly. When that running game is set at a bad number, because it has been set at a bad number with the exception of the Rice game this year, when that offense set at a bad number as far as your equation goes. Again, I teach history, not math, but I think I got this part right. If there's only one variable and it goes down, that's a problem. And if Houston's relying on only one variable ever having the chance of going up, that's also a problem. Now, the defense did have trouble getting off the field. Defensive special teams committed 5 penalties. They gave up first downs. That is bad football. That is Cougs beating Cougs, and we were told that is not supposed to be happening. It did, but we're told it's not supposed to be. The other thing is that, the penalties seem to be going up. I think that, the first couple games, again, there are no preseason games. And so I could get how, against UNLV and Oklahoma, you get a couple or whatever, but they're supposed to be working their way out. Good teams have less penalties as the year goes on. And I don't think it's crazy to think that should be happening with Houston right now. Even, talent-based things aside, as they're rebuilding this roster and program, things like committing penalties don't have to be talent-based. They can be discipline-based, right? And they were poor at that on Saturday. I do think that there's a chance that's an anomaly, right? The 11 a.m. game in Cincinnati, first one of those this year. We saw Houston play poorly in Kansas State with a lot worse weather, but a very similar otherwise situation a year ago, and what was probably one of the worst, a bad Dana Holgorsen game we all saw, right? I think that the other thing I'm encouraged by, though, in this game is that so Houston gave up 34 points. 24 of those were in the first half. That is to say that whatever the defense talked about at halftime, they seemed to clean it up a little bit. Now, Cincinnati had their way running the football. They ran that zone, and they cut back the zone play a lot. And it looked like to me they were running zone and using their guards in ways that took advantage of overzealous linebackers, Michael Batten and Jamal Morris. Those guys, I think, really over pursued. I know I saw Kendrick Yank get way out of position one time in over pursuit that sticks out of my head as being pretty bad. That was on the second watch. Didn't see a lot, to be frank. He gets that far off the screen. But the cutback was open because of that a lot. And they really kind of, in looking at charting things, I think PFF got thrown off, Pro Football Focus, because they charted some places like runs to the right that were or counters to the right when it wasn't a counter right. It was a zone left that cut back that far. And I say all that to say that's also Cougs beating Cougs in a way that I don't think is nearly as documentable. It's not as concrete or tangible, but it's also bad, right? Second half was cleaner, to be fair. As far as the naysayers go, the people upset with this team or whatever go, they didn't take the deep shots as Xavier Henderson in the second half like they did in the first. Houston had trouble with him one-on-one in a way that was concerning. I am willing to think of that as an anomaly if they come back and have a pretty good week this week against Iowa State in the backfield and defensive backfield. But I will say that I think this defense was kind of predicated on the DBs being able to hold their own and letting those guys kind of win those matchups. They lost two of them at really inopportune times, and I don't think there has to be some damning calling card or whatever that really sinks this team. But it's not great, right? It's not great. And I look at this team top to bottom and still think the defense has a lot of talent on it. I'm waiting for a couple big plays out of Brandon Mack. He's been solid. I really need him to be more than that, right? Keith Cooper had a less than Keith Cooper kind of game on Saturday. You wonder, if he has a big sack or he has a big TFL, and they opened with, I should say, the first series. Corey Kiner hasn't been tackled behind line of scrimmage yet this year, and they had him for a couple TFLs in the first couple series, including the opening play of the game. I think they came ready in that sense, but it was once they had to adjust for needing the help in the back half, they suddenly kind of fell flat in the front half, and that back and forth can't happen. I don't think this is a permanent thing, and I'm working my way a long way around back to saying that this is the kind of game that feels like, okay, we got that out of our system. We understand we got some things to fix. We're not going to play every game at 11 a.m. in Cincinnati. We got to get these things right. And so while Iowa State presents different challenges, they are going to run the ball. And I'd imagine you'll see a heavy dose of zone after the way that Corey Kiner cut those things back last week. I think Houston's got a chance to really show up and fix those things and show that they fix those things. And I think if if I were a betting man, I'd bet that they do feel a little bit different. And I think that we'll look back at that as more of an anomaly kind of game defensively. But if the offense turned the ball over and stuff like that, it may not matter. We'll see. I want to talk about one group that played well on Saturday. Can we do that? Let's do that. So in a second. But first, today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Last tickets, lowest price guaranteed, and they got all kinds of cool things to help you out in getting those tickets. Seat views, see that seat from that event at that venue, or that type of event at that venue. So concerts, comedy shows, theater, sports events, whatever's going on, you can see what it's going to look like from that seat at that venue for that type of event. Lowest price guarantee means they'll credit back 110% of the difference. You can find tickets in the same section and row for less somewhere else. So make sure you're getting the best deal always. And your purchase is always covered the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Download the Game Time app, create an account, or use code Locked On College for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code Locked On College, LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. All right, I want to show the O-line some love here. And I think that, whether it's Locked On Cougs or whoever you listen to, I think we've dogged the O-line when they played poorly in previous games. And I would point out that there were moments here where Houston had a little bit of trouble at different tackle spots. But in watching this a second time on Sunday, because I went from watching the Texans blow it to watching the Cougs blow it a second time. That's how Sunday is in football these days, I guess. Anyway, I feel like I can safely say that was the best of the 4 games this year the offensive line has played. And as a unit, Pro Football Focus scores, which they record if you're in the right place, the right time, doing the right thing, what percentage of the time, etc. Pro Football Focus scores would reflect that as well. Houston did perform better running the football as an offensive line group than passing it, but they also did a pretty good job of holding up in pass protection, where in previous games you could blame bad passing game on being rushed and things like that. This was not the case. Houston held down the 3-3-5 defense pretty well up front. Admittedly, a defensive front that is favorable to the offensive line, but certainly felt like they handled it like a good unit would. I guess a couple guys had comparable scores to the Rice game, but this game is by far and away the highest ranking game across the board for those guys as far as the grades go of the 3 losses. Donovan Smith had over 3.1 seconds to throw the football. And while that's, teetering on the edge of taking too long to throw the football, that is a long time that he's getting before he's getting hit. Zeon Chriss, who's not even really a thrower, took over 2.9 seconds. Houston was able to provide pockets. Again, 3-3-5 defense helped them out some, but on the whole, Houston's able to really provide pockets that really helped out Donovan and the guys. I said on Friday's episode that I thought one matchup that Houston had to win was Pancake Hunter versus the Godfather Dante Corleone. And I will say, with the exception of 2 or 3 plays that Corleone's a pro probably this spring. I think that Pancake won a lot more of those plays than he lost. I think, without calling out names, they grew right tackle spot, had a couple miscues where he got beat off the ball here or knifed under there. There was one, I think it was a short yardage zone play, and the stacked defensive end on top of the tackle cut all the way across the guard, made a play from the backside. But on the whole, those are the kind of plays you kind of one hand. There weren't a whole lot of those. Offensive line played all right, and I think that we dogged those guys when they played bad against. They played really poorly against UNLV. They had their work cut out for them against Oklahoma at the edges for sure. And I feel like they've kind of held their own this week and last. And so, if you're looking for positives or building blocks, I think that's where you put it. And again, I said in the reaction show, but Rashawn Sanford did have 62 yards on 6 carries, And had he not fumbled it twice, his running numbers would look pretty strong, and he probably gets a couple touchdowns because they would have had him in the game down there inside the 10 on both of those. Um, so all that is to say that there are things that are slowly getting better, and I don't mean that to say like that. Iman Yagavi, the offensive line coach, is like leaving Saturday smiling or something like that because no one coaching that team should be, or would be, or any evidence that they were. But I do think his group played all right on Saturday, and I don't think they get the love for that because the offense looked so bad. And I think for the first time in a while, we can definitively say they looked bad for more than just that reason because it was something else. And that means, got other stuff to fix, obviously, but it's, I guess, one thing you don't leave that game feeling like you have to fix necessarily. Anyway, we got stuff to preview with Iowa State this week. I always talk myself into a win by Friday, so we got to do some talking between now and then to get there. Big time basketball recruit coming to town next week for the Iowa State game, but that weekend as well. Big time potential stuff about to happen in the basketball program if things go right. So we got to break that one down. Locked On Coogs will be here doing all of it with the latest news each and every day. So Locked On Coogs, proud member of the Locked On Podcast Network. If you're looking for a second or at this point third listen of the day, I'm going to recommend Locked On Big 12 as well. Drake's doing a great job breaking down the whole conference. Locked On Coogs is a proud member of the Locked On Podcast Network. That means your team every day. Go Cougs.